Welcome to another exciting mystery solving video. In this one, because I have solved the mystery of Jupiter, I can answer the world's top 20 questions. Why is Jupiter so big? Why does Jupiter have auroras? Why does Jupiter have a great red spot? A storm that will not die. Why does it have strange moons? Why is it the only other planet in our solar system with a magnetic field deflecting solar winds? All these questions, why it has rings, we're going to answer in this video. Jupiter is a very mysterious world. These are the questions we will go through about its size, its red spot, its strong gravity, its distance from the sun. So for the first question, why is Jupiter so big? You can fit 11 Earths across Jupiter's diameter. Therefore, the surface area of Jupiter is exactly 120 times that of the Earth's, and its volume is 1,321 times that of the Earth, and the mass is 318 times that of the Earth. And you can fit 1,000 Jupiters into the Sun. And we have a equatorial circumference in feet of 1.44 times 10 to the 9. We also have a cross-sectional disk area of 1.535. Now that is seen from Earth. Every planet has it. Is Jupiter's measurement. We can see if we look at the shape of Jupiter, it's not perfectly round, it's slightly oblate, it's squashed in at the north and south pole, but how much so calculates to a ratio of 1.07, the number of the beast. Now if you've not seen my other videos, you'll have to go away and watch that. I cannot keep covering old ground. Some of you who are astute, you might recognize straight away some of these numbers. For instance, the 318, the 144, the 120, that these are biblical numbers. The 1000, it's looking very biblical all of a sudden. Why is that? Well, if you go into the Holy Bible, you'll notice that every chapter 11, verse 11, speaks of might and strength and power. And wherever you do find the 120 in the Bible, speaking of man's limit to life, the 13:21 can be found in these passages where it speaks of afflictions and the mighty one of Jacob, and also in the book of Revelations 13:21, it's about the beast being exposed, Satan defeated, and the creation of the new world. The 144 is found in Revelation 21:17, where it speaks of a wall God makes to separate man from disease and death. The 1000 can be found in this passage in Psalm 84:10, where it says, "One day in thy courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere." So this starts to lead us to a theme of strength and might. 318, in the story of Abraham, Lot is in a city that needed rescuing. So he was given 318 rescue warriors to save him from the city before God destroyed it, because they were all full of sin. 318 is 3 times Jesus' number, 106. So you could look at this like salvation is the Trinity times Jesus' number. If you look at the size, like the equatorial diameter in feet, hands, kilometers, cubits, the equatorial circumference in kilometers, feet, the average radius in cubits, kilometers, and other aspects of Jupiter like the jet wind speeds, all of these can line up with passages in the Bible that speak of being the most high and almighty God, and the great things he does, and thy righteousness, and the power of the word. And this one here, 439. 439 is found in a number of measurements in Jupiter, and the 439th verse in the Bible is this one, where it says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" So since I've found quite a big emphasis on strength and hand, I decided to do a quick look to see what other aspects of Jupiter can find references to strength and hand and might. And very quickly I found all of these. So there's many, many measurements that have this association with strength and hand and might. The equatorial circumference of 272 in the book of Matthew 27:2, there it speaks of Jesus being led away and handed over to Pontius Pilate. So it has this theme to it of crucifixion. And then 2772 passage in the Bible is this one, Leviticus 2:9, where it speaks of a sweet Savior, and other measurements that speak of sweet smelling Savior to God and mighty God, and how these values tie up with the size of Jupiter. Jesus caught 153 fish. Now 153 times 2, Jesus could be considered the second within the Trinity, number 2. And 153 times 2 is 306. 306 comes up because that is the provision number of wagons that God gave his people. If you look at the surface area of 6.15 times 10 to the 10, it's equal to 120 earths. There is references to, is there room in thy father's house, and gave all thee thy debt. So this has a theme of forgiveness, grace, allegiance to Christ theme to it. 14% of Jupiter's equatorial arc is 106.14.26 miles. Now 106, Jesus' number. 14 and 26, Exodus 14:26 speaks of Moses stretching out his hand and parting the sea. So why does parting the sea have anything to do with this theme that Jupiter's giving us in relation to its size? Well, that's because Moses, when he parted the sea and freed God's people, that was an act of salvation. So to answer the question about Jupiter's size, what does it line up to? It's lining up with the hand that subdues chaos, a wall of protection, and a covenant of strength. Let's move to the next question about the red spot. So Jupiter's red spot, it sometimes moves in a longitudinal fashion, but not a latitude fashion. It doesn't move up and down. It rotates. Just like the cloud bands. The cloud bands are all running this way, but nothing's moving this way. The red spot is locked at 22 degrees. And it's the red spot is the same size as the Earth. If you take Jupiter and you split it over this red spot line, and you look at it this direction, this is what you see. You have the North Pole, the South Pole, and if you took a line and you constructed a line to the center of Jupiter, you then set up these angles with the North and South Pole. And that angle with the North Pole is 112, and with the South Pole, 68. And 112 and 68, they therefore produce the inner angles of 34 and its opposite sides, and 56. So you got these measurements here, 56, 68, 34. What does it all mean? Well, we're going to look on the next slide how this aligns and joins the theme that we have so far for Jupiter. So it's a very good question to ask for number 2. Also be able to calculate exactly 300 million cubits is the distance between the Great Red Spot and the North Pole. 300 million exactly. So surely that tells you, hey, this thing is designed for something. So on our next slide, we're going to match up what all this means. Look at that. Boom. The equatorial chord percent between the Great Red Spot and the equator, 19% and 34 degrees, brings us to this passage, John 19:34. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side. 53 degrees is the Great Red Spot to the South Pole arc. And there it says in Isaiah 53, but he was wounded for our transgressions. The 56% chord to the South Pole lines up with John 5 verse 6. This is he who came by water and blood. In 22 degrees south of the equator, the Great Red Spot lines up with John 2 verse 2. He himself is anointing sacrifice for our sins of the whole world. And that's why the red spot is the same size as the earth. Took away the sins of the whole world. We also find the 22 degrees matching with the 16 brings us to this passage, Psalm 22:16. For dogs have encompassed me. They assembled of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Chapter 27 in the book of Matthew, which speaks of Jesus' crucifixion. And they crucified him. The 300 million. Now, Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. At the same time, the 300 cubit ark length was the ark of Noah, who saved all the animals from the great flood. So that could be viewed as a vessel of salvation, which is like what Jesus is and was during his crucifixion. There are many other measurements here, like the 52,000 miles to the South Pole. In Isaiah 52, there it speaks of he was pierced for our transgressions. And here are some more. Zechariah 1:3 verse 7. Strike the shepherd. Luke 1 verse 37. With God nothing shall be impossible. 448 million feet brings us to Numbers 35 verse 7. Where it actually says 48 cities of the Levites. So blood guilt was judged. 112 angle to the North Pole brings us to John 1 verse 12, where it speaks of as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God. It's all very strongly related to Jesus' crucifixion and what he gave and did. 66-degree longitude brings us to Genesis 6:6. The Lord was grieved in his heart. Now, that 22 degrees, if you sum all these passages up that sum up to 22, you'll find that all of them speak of blood and sacrifice and forgiveness and faith and all these things which are heavily related to Jesus' crucifixion. The great red spot to the North Pole, the meridian arc, is 27,160,619. Now, 27 is the chapter where Jesus is crucified. 160 can be viewed as 106, Jesus' number. And 619 can bring us to this passage here, Luke 6, verse 19. Power was coming from him, and he was healing them all. So the theme here is blood covered the sins of the whole world, his body enduring the storm of the wrath. There are some other 22 alignments here with Isaiah 22:22, where it speaks of the key of the house of David will lay upon his shoulders. He shall open and shut, open and shut. And this open-shut theme does come up again. The 57.7% can bring us to Psalm 57, verse 1. Where it speaks of be merciful and unto calamities be overpassed. Romans 5 verse 7 brings us to this one, where it speaks of for scarcely for a righteous man will die, and a good man someone would even dare to die. And in Romans 5 verse 8, but God condemneth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners Christ died for us. Now Europa is an interesting moon that NASA has sent a satellite to investigate whether it has life or not. If you look at Europa, does that not look like somebody's back who's been whipped 39 times? So Jesus was lashed 39 times during his crucifixion. There in the book of Corinthians, it speaks of 5 times received I 40 stripes save 1. Now I can find the number 39 quite easily, 5 times in the dimensions and aspects of Europa. Europa's volume in liters is this, 15,926,900. Now, in Revelation 1:5, there it speaks of washed us from our sins in his own blood. In Hebrews 9:26, there it speaks of to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. In Psalm 22, there it speaks of the suffering righteous one. And in Hebrews 9:26-22, that's where it speaks of without shedding of blood is no remission. If you take Europa's axis tilt and you add it to Jupiter's tilt, or you calculate the difference, you'll get to this for each moon. But for Europa, it's 0.47. Now, if you take 4 times 7, which is 28, and you take 4 plus 7, which is 11, and you add that together, you get 39. On top of that, 39 times 12 is 470. Now, every passage chapter 4, verse 7, you will see a relationship here that is related to Jesus' whipping, being lashed, and Jesus submitting himself for crucifixion. This here is a radiation map of Europa. Now, this is the very whipped side, and this is the middle side that faces Jupiter. So this side here faces Jupiter, and this side faces the Sun. So why does it do that? Well, you may say Jesus continuously presenting his sacrifice towards God. And Europa's inclination of 1.79 degrees would bring us to this passage here, Luke 1:7-9, to give light to them that sit in darkness, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. 159 is love in Hebrew, going back to the 159, 269. 269 is sister. So it puts together this theme that it's not a real rebel weapon. It's treasury for God's work. And it's to do with this shepherd king's theme. There are some further measurements of Europa and how it matches the 39, the 53, the pierced side, and how it matches healing and blessings and wounded, etc. Now, NASA has recently sent a probe to detect if there's life. We may say, well, now that we understand Europa more clearly, thematically, would you find life? And the answer to that question is yes. Europa does not demonstrate death in a dead world. It's very much alive. It's just bleeding. The crown of thorns that was put upon Jesus' head during his crucifixion is spelt out in these three passages in the book of Matthew, the book of Mark, and the book of John. In Matthew 27:29, there it speaks of they plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head. In the book of John, Jesus is wearing the crown of thorns. In the book of Mark, they plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head. So these passages here, 27:29, 19 and 5, these are the total number of moons, the arc lane between the spot and the North Pole, the equatorial chord distance. If you want to go back for a moment and have a look, let's have a look at this diagram again. We have 19% is the diameter, and the distance between the Great Red Spot and the equator is 16.6 thousand miles. The next question is, why does Jupiter have such strong gravity? Well, let's study the gravity for a moment. Now, if this is Jupiter's body, and this is the space as you leave Jupiter and you're going up into space, so the gravity gets less as you move away from Jupiter, but inside Jupiter, gravity becomes greater and greater, and pressure becomes greater and greater. You would put at this level the gravity aspect, which is 24.79. Now there is the 2 and the 48, if you round. 2 and the 48. 48 comes up in the study of Jupiter quite a lot because it represents Jesus when he is sitting with the elders, the 24 elders. Every passage in the Bible, 4:8, speaks of Jesus as the high king sitting on the throne. When we have that at the surface level, that's the calculated radius in kilometers. In kilometers, when it's 66,000 or 101,260 cubits, when we look at the 33,000 kilometer value, how it represents a gravity constant of 111 meters per second. So as you do this, and you instead, let's go out, see how the 46 and the 57 match. Now, as you come out, and you come out all the way to Jesus' number and Satan the beast's number, there is a play here between these values. Now, these very passage numbers speaks of Satan himself transformed into an angel of light. So it looks right, but it's not. So it's being tested, and there is this theme here being built with the true door and the false door. So you have a decision to make. Do you go through the true door or the false door? So the deepest pull at 111, this is where order in a hidden place before anything rises. The 57 and the 46 matches where the deep lane is already claimed by the Holy One. So because Jesus is elevated from 57 to 66, and it took 46 years for the temple to build. Now God can keep a people in a fixed place. That's the polar hold at 66,000. The theme at 24 is gravity starts pointing to a door. As you come further out, there's two doors, almost identical, but must be judged. Then further out, there's persistence and pull is lighter, and even at the edge, the same choice remains. Now, Jupiter's mass of rounded 1.9 times 10 to the 27 draws this theme of being a held-back giant, and the 318 is the guardian. If you measure in astronomers' gravity constant for Jupiter of 1.2668653, that can be broken into 126, 686, and 53. And when you do that, you get to this theme that 126 is God's number himself. It's a very high Christly value, and it's a measured season. It saturates with the cubed covenant and everything at the servant edge, 53. So what is all this telling us? Well, if you couple in the Jupiter's gravity is 2.528, 2528 times that of the earth. When you look in these passages of Psalm 25:8, it teaches sinners in the way. So it's about the right way, the wrong way, and the burden wanderers under a heavier sky, the rulers being pulled back toward the shiny mediator to hear him speak. Now, when it comes to weight, because we have a mass, we can calculate what the value is of biblical money. Because in the old days, money was calculated based on its weight. And when you do that, you'll find that Jupiter weighs 5.55 talents. 555 or 55 does come up in many of Jupiter's other measurements. And here it's referencing a lamb for the burnt offering. Come all he who are thirsty. So it's a burden of provision of sacrifice. Question number 4. Why is Jupiter so far from the Sun? 1 astronomical unit is the distance between Earth and the Sun. Now Jupiter is 5.203. The orbit is not perfectly circular, it's slightly oval, so it has a nearest and a furthest distance. And when you take these into account, what can you learn? See the 49:49. In Genesis 49, it speaks of the scepter, the lawgiver, and the Shiloh to come, and he will gather his people. And it gives you this theme of wine and milk. In other words, milk and honey. Now the 52 can be found, all these passages that mention 52. It's about how God reigns, and all the work was finished in 52 days, and the 52 rulership, a stable kingship. 52 is double that of 26, which is God's name. 52 is also 4 times that of the rebellion number. If we look at the orbital path of Jupiter around the Sun, you have a distance of 4.889 times 10 to the 9 kilometers. And in the 4,886th verse, there it speaks of an inheritance and the children of God's people to himself for his own inheritance. So what does it bring us to? It's the law that establishes fixed boundaries, and God's allocation to safeguarding the line through the Messiah will come, preserving the allocation and safeguarding the line through the Messiah. We have 7.78479. Now, if you split that into 77, 84, and 79, 7 sevens is a prophetic mercy. Jesus called and said, you should do this not 7 times, but 77 times. And what's interesting is that Jesus himself was the prophet number 77. 84 is also mentioned where Anna a widow of about 84 years, speaks of the Redeemer to all who will look for redemption. So what is it all spelling out? It's this merciful outer court, peopled by watchers in God's house, offering light and peace to those emerging from darkness. We also have a duration of exactly 11.86 Earth years. Now, the 1187th verse in the Bible is this one, speaking about bring me out of this house, where Joseph's unjustly imprisoned asks to be remembered and brought out. So it's a time between suffering and enthronement. What's interesting I've found is that if you take the number of lashes Jesus was given and his pierced side, and you add that to the difference, which is 14, you get to 106. There's another number identifying Jesus that I have not listed in my list of how to get to Jesus' number and the beast's number. So this is why I enjoy making these videos, because you learn as you go. Next question. Why does Jupiter spin so fast? Jupiter has a very high spin rate of 9.9 hours per day for Jupiter. So it is spinning 2.42 times faster than Earth. And the equatorial speed is 26.43 times that of the Earth's. Now if you measure that in cubits, you will find that it's 23,480 cubits per second. The number of times Jupiter spins per 1 Earth year is 883. So when we break down these measurements and see what they give us, it points to Jesus the shepherd running a race around caring for his sheep. This value of 1016 has come up before. So I decided to do a comparison to see where it comes up. And you'll find that exactly 28 Earth hours, Jupiter will spin 1,106 degrees of rotation. So 28 is 4 sevens, 4 times the holy Sabbath number. So we can line them up all to these passages here. And what is it telling us? Well, so it's keeping a priestly charge in Egypt bound and defiled. It's people either walking in circumcised heart obedience and communion with the shepherd, or treating what God has cleansed as common. There are several passages that speak of a strong man to run a race, and a race is not to the swift. And the 99, and when you put this together, we also have the 400th and 80th year. So Jupiter is the absorber of stumbling blocks. And it gives us this theme of the good shepherd running a race around the flock to keep them protected. So it's a measure of wisdom, declares the shepherd who seeks the lost. What I found also interesting is that if you wait 18 hours on Earth and 0.36, 18 and 36, 18 that overcomes sin and 36 the labor of man, equals 666 degrees of rotation. Now that is the wisdom number. However, another way to look at it is one full turn plus the 306 wagons of provision. So what is that saying? It's turning with wisdom, and with provisions a man can turn around. Now the 883, all chapters 8 verse 8 is speaking of wisdom and righteousness and straight and out of the horrible pit. So it's God's super fast shepherd dog running a race on the fence system, circling the wall. So the next question to ask is about Jupiter's 12 Earth years. So Jupiter takes 0.439. Now we've seen this number before, 439 come up. And there it is in the orbital speed as well, which is 2.28 times faster than the Earth. So the Earth is 2.28 times faster around the Sun than Jupiter. And that equates to how many days? 4,333 days. 4,333, so it is 1 Jupiter year. Now in Isaiah 43:3, I am with you through waters and fire. And the 12-year orbital period brings us to this passage where it says, the Lord is on my side, I will not fear. Now the 144 Earth years is 12 Jupiter years. So what is that saying? It's saying a wall across time and generations, a guardian rhythms of God's patience and enclosure. We can also bring about all these passages here where it speaks of signs and seasons and days and years. I do a new thing in the way of the wilderness, to persecute and destroy under the heavens, to persecute and destroy them in anger under heavens of the Lord, the city of a great king. Let's move on to our next question. Can you land on Jupiter's surface? Jupiter's got a number of gases, and when we consider the pressure, temperature, density, and the gravity all together, we have a few interesting measurements to consider, as in the temperature at 1 bar and the height of the atmosphere itself. And what we learn here is that it's hiding a court. There are little gates to pass through, and how quickly the pressure climbs with depth. These measurements bring us out to these passages where it speaks of, will cause them to come near and come into the holy place. And then there's the wall and the boundaries divided the light and the darkness, and to lose the seals, the lions whelped and have not trodden it. And then the hand of the Lord was with them. So thematically, what is this pressure, density, gravity? What is it producing? And I would say, as you move through lawful steps, the wall of resistance that grows, the veil, the deep is hidden, and the hand, the order that constants rule and the system, not chaos. The gravity, the pull that sets how pressure builds with depth. The next question, number 8. What is Jupiter's atmosphere made of? Jupiter's atmosphere is generally hydrogen and helium. Now the hydrogen is set at 86%, 86 referring to teach me the way and reflected and borrowed light, and the helium, the 14%, deliverance. When we consider other gases like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and phosphine, it brings us to this band contrast where you have veils, chromophores, and vertical mixing. If you sum that up, you got stripes as the watchmen. In the book of Ezekiel, there speaks of these watchmen. There are layers. Why there are layers? Well, the ammonia gives us this theme of the upper mercy veil. The veil has 3 levels. There's the mercy veil, there's the guarded middle court, and then there's the foundation of evil behind the courts. So as Jupiter shines with borrowed light beneath the gate, guardian, not a second sun. There's a guardian beneath the gate. The 222 grams per mole of average molecular weight brings us to these passages in Genesis 2 verse 22, where it speaks of a helper and a companion woman, so providing an eternal sustenance and healing. So Jupiter's south pole consists of, there are 5 circumcumular polar cyclones. So there's 5 cyclones around one central one. So 5, and if you consider the North Pole, which we'll get to in a minute, has 8. So 8 on the north and 5 on the south gives us a total of 13. And we also have a latitude angle of 84 degrees south of the equator. So the cyclones at the South Pole, 1 plus 5 is 6, which is man's work at the judgment pole. So the South Pole of Jupiter is judgment, just like the Earth, but it's humanity's work at the bottom of the world. And the 84 is the accepted worship and the fishes of men. So this is where the accepted worship, like an offering that God regards, and the discipled fishes of men are regarded and respected and judged. Maybe the judges are going to be the fishes of men. So it's about turning judgment into rescue and recommissioning. That's the South Pole and what it's about. And don't forget, we have this shape between the North and South Pole, which gives us a oblateness measurement of 1.07. And this brings us into this context of the priestly badge, the 28, turn judgment into rescue and recommissioning. At the North Pole, we have 8 cyclones, and the sizes max out. Each one of them are a maximum of 4,600 kilometers. So this brings us to the 2446. 2446. And in Revelation 4 verse 4, which sums to 8, there it speaks of the throne and the 24 elders and the crowns of gold on his head. So the North Pole, this appears to be a throne and a crown. So a crown is the head of the planet. So we have bright jewels as a ring of shining Aurora, the king at the center, surrounded by living, unceasing glory. So this image was only taken very recently. We'd never seen it before, and I think it's quite exceptional and very clearly denoting a crown. So let's move on to the next question, number 9. Why do scientists call Jupiter a failed star? Well, there's not enough mass to ignite. It's in fact, if you measure it, it's in fact 13 Jupiter masses short. Now the Sun is 1,048 Jupiter masses. That's rounded. It actually calculates to exactly 1047. What is this all about? 13 is rebellion, and it's a limit marker. So it's establishing a weight to God. So scientifically, it's big enough to shield, but not big enough to burn. So Jupiter's power is limited on purpose, strength under authority. That's what it's trying to say. In the 1048th verse in the Bible is this one, Genesis 36:7. And it speaks of riches were more than mighty dwell together. So what is it about? It's about an abundance of forces, separation, so peace, order can continue. So in Acts 10:48, this is where Peter orders baptism in Jesus' name for the Gentiles. So rebellion and estrangement overcome by submission and entry into the covenant. So Jupiter's placed beneath 13 as part of an ordered constraint. So it's a held back giant whose very mass is a kingly talent, weighted and trusted under judgment, crowned in the heavens, yet kept below starhood by the master's hand. So it's short of fusion, long on purpose, and the sentinel under authority. In 104:7, this is where, but at your rebuke the waters fled, and the sound of your thunder they took flight. Question number 10. Why does Jupiter have strange colored cloud bands? We can split the colored cloud bands into the equatorial zone. Then we have the north and south equatorial belts. And we have the temperate zone and the inner temperate belt. And then the angle from the great red spot. If we bring that into account as well, then we have this set of numbers in degrees. And if we take Jesus' 39 lashes and we use that as a dividing factor, we can get to these values rounded: 18, 26, 21, 15, 100, and 200. Now there in John 19:15, that's where away with him, they crucified him. In John 19:18, where they crucified him. In 19:21, write not the King of the Jews. And Matthew 27:26, when he had scourged Jesus. And make a joyful noise, and with his stripes we were healed. This is how the stripes and the colored cloud bands can relate. But I found that it's not just related to Jesus' crucifixion, because also you can calculate how they match the story of Moses, as in Exodus. These passages here, which are the key passages to Moses parting the sea, can also be found, and it does kind of look like the seas being parted in some of these cloud images of Jupiter. If we take the wind speed of these cloud bands, we find that they are 336 miles per hour. Now in 336, it speaks of watching and warning. If the watchmen see, blow the trumpet and warn. And if we consider it measured in rods, there is the 107 that comes up, and it speaks of he raiseth the stormy wind. So I found many associations with the colored cloud bands and where wind is found in the Bible. Also, if you take that colatitude angular difference between the belts, which is 78 degrees, brings us to Psalm 78, where it says, He caused an east wind and a south wind. So it's a host of opposed jets. Also, what I found is that if you take the belt values that we associated earlier in degrees and you sum them up, you can get to 77. So that identifies Jesus' prophet number. So the whole face sums to the prophet. Basically, all the faces of all the cloud bands is pointing to Jesus' prophet number, which is of mercy. If we consider the daily drift, in other words, how far, based on the wind speeds, does the clouds move on Jupiter, and you'll get to these values, and which point to John 12, verse 36, where it says, While ye have light, believe in the light. So it's about a well-ruled road of light. And in 111 speaks of the works of his hands and the verity of his judgment, and teach me the way and prepare the way. If we consider the temperature of the belts, we can get to these passages where it speaks of the way of the just is uprightness, and high skies are wide open and dramatic, and the key shall open and none shall shut. If we consider some other values like the 439 in Jupiter's equatorial circumference, and we consider the 82, which Ganymede's diameter, we come to these verses like Mark 4 verse 39, where it says, And he rose and rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. In Matthew 8 verse 26, there it speaks of he arose and rebuked the winds. And again in Luke 8:24, so you got the 82 twice. And he arose and rebuked the wind. So what is all this pointing to? It's pointing towards storm power God raises and steers, not chaos. Preparing the road and walk in truth and believe in the light. Faith. It speaks of him opening and shut. Jesus is the way. The long-lasting witness, the counted helpers and cycles, and a ruled globe. So what is this all about? At the cross, the storm, the darkness and the shaking was still under God's hand by Jesus' death and rising. The door is open and the way is made. If you measure Jupiter's speed of sound, on Earth, speed of sound is 343 meters per second. But on Jupiter, because it's different gases, it equals 300 meters per second exactly. So the 3-lane we have again, and in John 3, there it speaks of the wind bloweth and being born again of the Spirit. So what is this about? Also we have the 300th verse where God speaks to Abraham and instructs Abraham to bring out his people out of persecution. So it's a boundary call. Abraham is told to leave one realm and step into another. Let's move on to the next question. Why does Jupiter shine so bright? Jupiter is one of the brightest objects you're going to see for half of every year. Half of the year you go outside at night, in the middle of the night. If you don't see the full moon, you're going to see Jupiter. So Jupiter, most of its light is reflected from the sun. It does, however, have a faint glow. In other words, Jupiter is under so much pressure and temperature from Earth, you can see it if it's in the shade glow, but it's very rarely in the shade. And these are the measurements you'll get. Now solar flux, this 50.3 watts per square meter, is how strong the sunlight is. It's bouncing off Jupiter. The albedo tells us how much of that sunlight the planet keeps versus reflecting. So the albedo is how much light Jupiter absorbs, which is 0.52. We have an incident power of 7.7. So this is the sunlight Jupiter intercepts. So how much light Jupiter receives. Now there's another measurement of the speed of light. We'll get to the speed of light later, but the speed of light takes 8 minutes to get to the Earth, but light takes 43.3 minutes to get to Jupiter. Reflected power, so that's a duration. Now reflected, the bond albedo, so light which is reflected off the Sun, not absorbed by Jupiter, but bounced off into space, is 3.9 times 10 to the 17 watts. Earth reflects 5.2 times 10 to the 16 watts. So Jupiter is 7.5 times brighter. So now that we have our basic values and we want to know what they mean, we also have a apparent magnitude. This is when Jupiter is in direct opposition. It has a magnitude of minus 2.9. So now that we have our numbers, we can look at the next slide to understand them. The 5.2 aligns to how beautiful the feet that brings good news. So it's about a messenger or mirror. The 3.9 is about stripes and healing. The 2.9 is about majestic proclamation. The 5.2, again, proclamation of the pierced servant. 922 speaks of blood secured light. So when you bring the prophet and the victory into this theme, where we have these passages where it speaks of covering and atonement, where he made coats of skins and clothed them. And then we have in passage number 17, to give light upon the earth. So light given and victory. We also find matches with these passages where it says he wept aloud. So it's compassion at the wound, and the priesthood line, and joy of salvation, and borrowed glory, and for he is a prophet. So the explicit prophet tag. If you put this together, what do we have? What's it saying? Well, Jesus' sacrifice is the true light whose stripes bring healing and victory. Here is another table where we can see the measurements of the intrinsic flux and how it bears up pillars, the hand holding the system together, sustaining power. So the hidden hand, the hand behind a veil, working under a wall of pressure, speaking outward through a disciplined gate of emission. Moving on to the next question, number 12. How powerful is Jupiter's magnetosphere? The magnetic field around Jupiter is the only other one in our solar system other than the Earth that deflects harmful solar wind coming off the sun. Now, the magnetic moment is 20,000 times that of the Earth, and the width of the magneto disk is 150 times that of Jupiter. We also have a gauge, which is the measure of how strong a magnetic field is, ranging between 4 and 14. The Aurora is related to the magnetic force field around the planet, just like Earth's Aurora. We also have Io, one of Jupiter's moons, dumping 1 ton per second into the North Pole. And if we also include the spin of roughly 10 hours a day, let's take all this into account. If we combine or cross-link question 12 with question 13, because the magnetosphere is in relation to the radio wave. In relation to the radio waves can be separated into the frequency or the pitch, which gives us the gauge, the strength. And the pitch can be measured in thousandths per second, millionths per second, and billionths per second. In other words, kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz. Now, there's also there's a radio family. You have the family of the kilometric, which is low-pitched. Then we have the hectometric, which is between KOM and DAM. DAM is the decimetric, which is only 10 to 40 megahertz. And then we have the decimetric, which is a steady radio from fast electrons trapped near Jupiter's radiation belt. So what's interesting is I found, so we have these values basically to examine and answer for. But before we do that, understand where the 107, the beast's number, comes into the calculation here. Because at 3 megahertz divided by 2.8 is 1.07 gauge. So at that higher measure, the upper band, we have this idea of the beast. And we will understand the theme in a moment. But it's important for that to notice that. Now, if we answer both questions, why is Jupiter having such a strong magnetosphere, and why does it have powerful radio waves? Brings us to these passages with Psalm 100. The difference between point 1 and 10 is 100. And there it speaks of make joyful noise, noise. Then we have the thousands to 1,000 generations. So it's a faithful supply into the stream. Then we have the 10 hours, God called the dry ground land. So it's naming, ordering, and rotation organizes the court. It's an organizing of this court. Then in regards to the radio, we have alignments here with keep his commands and the length of the ark of salvation, and the sheep hear my voice and the voice of the Lord, and their line is gone out through all the earth. So it's a broadcast calling. So what does this mean? Solar winds coming from the sun being deflected. So it traps and recycles plasma. So the radiation belts and the auroras, that's what they're doing. They're deflecting and trapping and causing this aurora. Then we have Io, which is an auroral footprint, and a powered within. So we have metallic hydrogen dynamo and a rapid spin. So from within the shield, not a mere wind bubble. So it's being caused. It's set up, created, and caused. Now, the 20,000th is mentioned in this verse, 68:17. The chariots of God are 20,000. So what it is, it's an unseen host powering the shield. And the 150 is named in these three passages. There's several passages that speak of this 150. And it speaks of all flesh had corrupted his way. So it's the vast shield that restrains chaos. Then we have the gauze, which is 4 and 14. And that speaks of dividing the light from the darkness. So it's a field that separates and orders. So in regard to the shield, the magnetosphere speaks radio waves. The shield is the magnetosphere, and the radio waves speak. So the same magnetic wall that stands off storms also declares the boundary and radio at the poles. And the DIM from the belts, whose IO replies confirms order in the court. So we have the shield, which is refuge, order, and reach. The shield that speaks, the voice of proclamation. The good news, the 52, the good news, the distance, the orbital period, the prophet times the victory, blood, healing, and triumph. The priestly court. We have radiation, reality. So the inner belt of MEV particles, that's the lethal dose. So you need very high shielding to get a satellite close up. So what it's about is refuge and sovereignty at the same gate. So refuge and severity. Refuge and severity. So the magnetic might and the radio voice integrate the light study to Jupiter's system, mirrors the theme or the gospel that says refuge, stripes, proclamation, priestly access, and victory. Now where the 107 and the sin, the beast's number, comes into play here is that the threshold is at the very upper band, the highest band. It's a discernment hinge teaching us to choose the lawful door. Now when we consider the aurora, what is that theme bringing into play here? How does the aurora, Jupiter's poles are a gate that speaks, okay, multi-terawatt light and radio driven by a faithful hand of IO-fed plasma. Now these measurements here, the auroral power, the offloading of IO, the radio band frequency, the polar radio band frequencies, the cyclones at the North Pole and the South Pole. When you put this together, what are we reading here? What is this saying? What's the bright cloud veil hides the engine below. The aurora crown makes its voice impossible to miss. And also in the passion sense, these are the crowd's voices, the king himself. So the crowd is speaking and shouting and blah, 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 but the king himself remains silent. In the next question, number 14, why does Jupiter have so many moons? Well, up until recent years, officially Jupiter had 90 moons, and then it was officially 95, and now it's, as of this year, on the 30th of April, officially there's 97 moons. Okay, we'll get to the numbers in a moment, but this is where they're all placed. If this is Jupiter and this North Pole, South Pole, between these bands, the 28 and the 52, between these bands is where all the moons are orbiting. Now, this one here is to include Jupiter's axis of 3.13 degrees. And if we look at this way, this now is Jupiter and it's tilted. And the inner bands sit here in this blue band. The blue bands sit this way. And the other bands sit this way. So all the moons are orbiting Jupiter out here. And the 8 that are tidally locked, known as the Galilean moons, are running around the center of it. So Jupiter is spinning this way around. If you look down on the North Pole, it's spinning the same direction. So these are prograde moons, and these ones are retrograde, against the spin. Some people believe that Jesus was not crucified on an upright cross like that, but he was actually, they used to crucify people on an X like this, the way it's shaped, which makes me wonder if that's not what it's relating to. The cross Jesus was crucified on, and around the center are the 8 Galilean moons, which represent the elders. If we consider the 29, 21, we have 8 and 21. Regular and irregular. Now, regular and irregular just means that some are close and some are far out. But all the moons together are split between a 30 and a 70% share. Now, if we take the official amount of moons, 97, then the sum of all retro sum up to 11,850 something degrees. Now, that is very close to 12,000. I believe it should be 12,000. When it goes to 99, it is 12,000 exactly. And that sums to how many turns is Jupiter makes 33 and a third turns. So that's interesting, because if Jesus was crucified during April, then, or Good Friday, then that means it was 1/3 of the year. So Jesus would have been 33 and 1/3. So I think this is correct. I think it should be a sum of 12,000, and the correct total is 99. So we have these these degree bands that the moons sit between. And if we bring in the 1535 equation, now 1535 is 306 times 5. So things line up here in regard to this being covered in Numbers 7 verse 3. Now 7 and 3 can relate to the 30 and the 70% of how the moons are divided in percentage, 30 and 7. And there it speaks of the 6 covered wagons, the 306 wagons, the wagons of provision. So what's going on here? Why is this relative? Well, the way I see it is that the moons, how they are rotating around Jupiter, 1535 is also wheel in Hebrew. Now, it's like there is a wheel, and Jesus is Jupiter sitting in the middle, and there is this rotation of righteousness and provisions. If we put this into a table format, so basically these are the 3 layers, or the 3 orbital angles. So if we go back to this one, there is 1, 2, and 3 orbital angles of these moons. And if we look at it here, so this one's Jupiter. So Jupiter sits as the provision wheel and the throne and the crown. Then the inner bands, the 8 regular, which are tidally locked, and they're tidally locked because they keep their faces towards Jesus. They have loyalty, and they represent the 8 times 3 is 24. So the 8 Galilean moons represent the elders sitting with Jesus. Then we have the 2 other big layers, which are the prograde and the retrograde. So some are going one way, some are going the other way. They are split 70-30, and they sit between these bands. Now, this band, the prograde band, relates to the Levite wagons and the spin servants circling the throne. So we have an idea of the wagon, the 306 wagon idea, which is a household running provisions and righteousness around the king. Now the retrograde, the other larger 70%, is in relation to the 70 nations and tribes, which include all the types of people you have around the world, except Africa. That's another story. But here is the 12,000, the 33 turns. That's the life, the year life of Christ. And put that together with the Sabbath weekly crown. You have his weekly time. So the nations are wrapped in his weekly time crown, under his life and patience, invited to join the inner household around the throne. So these are the invited. So on the one hand, you got the provisions and the righteousness. On the other, you got all the nations and the tribes. The tilt of Jupiter at 3.13. Now all verses, chapters 3 verse 1-3 in the Bible speaks of forgiveness and courage, and forgive each other as the Lord has forgiven you, but do not discourage because of my sufferings for you. That's captured in passages chapter 3 verse 13. Now these degree bandwidths between the two bands also bring together an idea of entry, praise, grace and suffering, full counsel and kingdom. Here is, you might say, as a repeat or further understanding, the 45 comes into place. 45 is the number Hitler mocked by rotating the swastika 45 degrees, because 45 is all about God's parallelism with man. God's going to draw this parallel line between him and man. Let's take a look at the next question. Why does Io have so many volcanoes? Io is a very volcanic world. It has 400 active volcanoes and 1,000 volcanic features. Interesting number, 14,000. So just what does it mean? The tidal, first of all, you got tidal heating, which is Jupiter's gravity and pull of Europa and Ganymede stretch and encompass Io's interior. So there's a play here between Io and the other moons, and what it is about is, just as rebellion is pressed under God's judgment, Io is continually strained until it bursts into fire. Then we have melting rock, so friction liquefies Io's interior into a sea of magma. So this is unseen fire beneath the surface, reflects the inward corruption of mankind. We have explosive eruptions, the 300 miles high, speaks of the mighty hand lifted high. Then we have the Aurora feeder, the volcanic gases steam into space and ignite Jupiter's glowing polar crown, or the Aurora. So what is that about? That's the throne of God, fuels judgment, fire, and covenant revelation. Here are some Hebrew words that Io matches up with its measurements. For instance, its measurement of 484. Its measurement of 784 times. 784 is fire. And here how you can get Io's measurements and why it fits. So the 400 may relate to 400 years. So Io has a prolonged season of judgment. There are 1,000 volcanic features, meaning every fire belongs to God. Io's heat embodies God's consuming jealousy. The plumes are mighty and hand raised high. Then we have this fire below, brilliant light above. So Io fuels Aurora's crown again, upholding the throne. They trample all over the city, holy city, for 42 months. So 42 is a measurement. Io's orbit is 42 hours, and 42 comes up. So what's that about? It's about Io's orbit mirrors fixed boundaries of judgment. And then we have its semi-major axis. 4217th verse in the Bible is, I believe this one, Numbers 16:32. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up. So it's about Io's orbit echoes rebellion swallowed up in judgment. In relation to Io dumping 1 ton of material into Jupiter's North Pole, 1 kilometer per second is 2,237 miles per hour. And in Luke 2:22, verse 37, there it speaks of a numbered with the transgressor. So what is it? It's a passion verse, suffering counted among the guilty. So when we look at the radius of Io, it speaks of, it shall not quench night or day, the smoke thereof shall go up forever. And the gravity constant and mass. Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up to rebuild Jericho. And the orbital speed matches this passage here where it says, they showed his signs among them and the wonders of the land of Ham. And then we got orbital speed. Call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things. So that is the orbital speed measured in cubits per second. Brings us to Jeremiah 33:3. So it's about Io's motion becomes the covenant voice. When it comes to escape velocity, 25:8, Isaiah 25:8, this is where it speaks of he will swallow up death forever. So volcanic fire to ultimate release and redemption. So what is this telling us? Scientifically, the volcanoes erupt because Jupiter's immense gravity melts and stirs its interior. But prophetically, you may say the volcanic witness declaring and consuming fire of God, his covenant voice, his mighty hand lifted high, and his throne crowned in radiant glory. So Io burns because of Jupiter's throne, and Io testifies that the throne of God itself drives judgment, fire, and mercy. If you take a look at Io's orbital circumference, you get this 2,649,619. So we've seen 619 to do with healing, power coming from him. But this 2664 is interesting because there it says, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. So that theme there it's a royal verdict of a high priest's court, a right hand of power and appearing in the clouds. Let's move to the next question. Question number 16. Why does Ganymede have its own magnetic field? Ganymede has this feature of a row of, looks like little meteorites. Ganymede also has these drag marks all over it. Now Ganymede has an axis tilt of exactly 0.33, look at that. Also with Ganymede's the only other known body other than Jupiter itself and the Earth with a magnetic force field that protects it from solar winds from the sun is Ganymede. Ganymede is the third and only place that we know of. So why is that? And when you take some measurements and you start adding things up, clearly we get a measurement of 106, Jesus' identification number. We can calculate that and the ratio percentage between Ganymede and the Earth's moon. We also have these Aurora belts over the equator, which is 2 and 6 degrees. We have a rocking cadence of 10.5 hours per cycle. And then we have the drag marks, which I've spoken about. So what does all this add up to? Well, the 52, again, is the shepherd and the leader over time. The volume is pointing towards kingship. The sidereal period of Ganymede is 7.155 days. 715, this is the outer shield versus the inner period. Then we have the average density, which brings us to the sanctuary and dwelling inside the wall of protection. Let's consider a moment the angular and orbital law. So the tilt brings us to enduring life. The Laplace resonance of 1, 2, and 4 brings us to 4, which is door and gate. The eccentricity of 0.13 brings us to hold things together within lawful limits. So we have this magnetic shield and the greater work. Only moon with intrinsic field, a shepherd's wall enclosing a fold. So it has nested fields, which are mini magnetosphere inside Jupiter's magnetosphere, a big wall, little wall. So it's big wall, little wall. That's what the theme is. And ordered waters beneath instruction. So there's an ocean witness, so a possible ocean under the crust. So what is this pointing to? It's pointing to one being cared for another. Like this is God and this is Jesus. Jesus is being taken under the wing of God. That's what this is pointing to. Now the drag marks. The motion allowed, but motion is governed. So it's the shepherd's rule over moment. The shepherd's rule over movement. The two witnesses. And protection by repetition. So we have some passages that we are brought to when we take some measurements, and that's prepare ye the way, cast up the highway. So he leadeth me in paths of righteousness, and he led me the right way. So that's what these drag marks are trying to emphasize. Also, we have the 10.5-hour candle of this magnetic field. When the lamb rocks only 2 degrees. So the ice records drag marks, paths with instruction, because water and law live inside the king's wall. The 8, this line here is found at this location, 38 degrees by 13 west. So basically you got like 39 and 14 west. You could sum that up. If we look at all passages 3 and 8, we have a theme here, come down to deliver them. The priests stand in the Jordan, and the marrow to thy bones, and it speaks of the wind and the spirit. In Deuteronomy 30 verse 8, thou shalt return and obey the voice of the Lord. So it's a cry to thee, remove far from me vanity and lies. So this mini stripe, what it's saying is return, obey his voice, cry out, and have lies removed while you're fed the right portion. So don't be deceived. Walk the straight path. That's what it's saying. In Psalm 100, we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving. So it's all about the sheep herder and his sheep and his righteous ways. Ganymede's orbital distance is 107.10 to the 6. So you have the 107, the beast's lane, that comes into Ganymede's orbit around Jupiter. Why is that? When we put it together, we have Job's 1070 verse becomes pictures of controlled arena where the adversary can rage but cannot write the final line. So suffering, divine, and wisdom. So going back to the rocking, the amplitude of Ganymede's auroras, it's between 6 and 2 degrees from the equator. So there's a swing of 4 degrees. There are 31 degrees wide, the aurora latitude band width. We also have a 100 degree separation. We have the rocking period of 10.5, and we even have a polar field strength of 14,440 NT, and an equatorial field strength. So what this 2 and the 6 and the 4, what it's saying is there's a narrow way and the door. Putting that together, return and obey, 30. God is for those in sign. This ring is the flock's gate and pasture. So that is the gate of the shepherd and his flock. Cute. Psalm 23, here the 10.5 again, leadeth me the path of righteousness. So do you see how we can obtain 2.3 leading us to Psalm 23, which is about the shepherd leadeth me in righteous path. So it's about the shepherd that keeps a narrow, straight path for his flock inside the violent magnetic sea. Moving on to the next question. Number 17. Why is Callisto so dark and full of craters, far out and highly magnetic? Callisto is strange because it's this very dark moon that is the furthest out. Callisto is the furthest out moon of all the Galilean moons, And it's full of craters. There's so many craters you can't even count them. There's craters inside other craters and craters on top of craters. And it's very dark black in color. So what is this all adding up to? Well, one thing I found is that the speed of light, it takes 6.28 seconds to reach from Jupiter to Callisto at the speed of light. Now, what's further interesting is that 2 pi is 6.28. So 628 definitely has some strong meaning here in the study of Callisto. And when we calculate the number of orbital period or days, how many days it takes for Callisto to orbit is 16.689. The 166 has been found in many other measurements. But if you compare it with Proverbs, it speaks of the Lord directeth his steps. So in other words, it's not self-guided. The far distance is tuned. So light takes essentially 2 pi seconds to cross it. So it's the full circle light gate. So the steps at the gate are directed from outside, not self-guided. Callisto is far out because its light time cycle, every step of its slow orbit is directed. The outer rim is not random empty space. It's a completed light circle with God-directed cadence. So then the next question is, why is Callisto so dark? Well, the brightness and the amount of light reflected, the geometric albedo of Callisto is 0.22. We may refer back to Isaiah 22:22, where it speaks of the keys of house of David shall be upon his shoulder. So what's it saying? The lawful gate that opens and shuts under royal authority. So the key of David gate number. The orbital circumference of Callisto is 11,827,431 kilometers. In the 11,827 verse in the Bible speaks of, and also the burnt offerings were in abundance. And Callisto does give us, because it's so black, this impression that it's something burnt. So the burnt offerings in abundance. So the surface is burnt looking and battered. It impacts left on display rather than healed. So the dark scars, the burnt offerings in abundance. So it's where hits are recorded and the burnt record circles the king, not wiped away. Then we have Callisto's strong magnetic force field. So it has an induced magnetic field, which means that it requires an electrically conducting layer beneath. So if ocean is the model, then it has an induced dipole. So it has a conducting shell. So if you tie this up with the orbital period in days of 16.6 days, and you consider the redirected steps, Callisto is responding to Jupiter's field. So it's strongly magnetic because under the burnt outer ledger, where the conductive shell that still responds to the king's field. The outer wall looks dead, but the interior still feels and answers the field. So here are some Hebrew meanings from the measurements of Callisto. And its diameter lines up with door and gate. And the inclination, mercy and loving kindness. And the diameter in cubit is great and exalted. The next question is about question 18. What happens if 1 ton of material is dropped into Jupiter's north pole? We did touch on this when looking at Io earlier. But if we really wanted to ensure that we include a clear understanding of Io dumping 1 ton per second of material into Jupiter, and what does it mean? I thought this was very interesting. So what's going on here? So if we look at our measurements, we have 1 kilogram of flux, and you can measure that in kilogram per day, per year. So by mass, we have a 70% sulfur family and a 30%. So there's a 70 and 30 split between ions. So when we list our measurements here, including Jupiter's, because this is a relationship between Io and Jupiter question. The 42 brings us to the bounded window of time. We have references to the oral crown gate, lawful entry, the covenant of 1,000 by the 300 men and the 700 good. We have unite my heart, fear thy name theme. We have discipline and judgment and prevailing media. So Io's supply is a lawful muster by 1,000 and admit to service. Its fixed order ensures intruders are unbuilt. So the Aurora turns fire below into light above. The main 8 moons, Metis is the threshold gate, Adrastea is perimeter runner, Amathlia is nourishing servant, Thebe is borders and pillars, Io is the priestly fire and intercession, Europa is cleansing and healing, Ganymede is the mighty under mercy, rebellion bound, Callisto is the boundary sentinel or completion. So which court theme sits stronger? Okay, well, the throne king is still stronger in theme. The throne, Jupiter as the throne and the king. Another way you could look at it as Pilate's court. Jesus was silent. So the stronger theme that we're producing in this study is still to do with the throne and the king. But I have considered others. Moving on to question 19. Why are Jupiter's rings so faint and what do they mean? Jupiter's rings, you can measure the sizes of them. One thing to note is the pitch and the angle that we are viewing. Because Jupiter has a very small tilt, its equator is not at a great angle to us. So when we look at Jupiter, we see a very oblique angle of the rings. It's not like Saturn. With Saturn, because Saturn has a great axial tilt, its north and south pole has a much greater axis angle tilt. So we can see much greater surface area of the rings. The next thing to understand is that the rings of Jupiter are made of a certain ice that only you can see if you go around the other side of it. So if we travel to the other side of the rings and we have the sunlight behind them, then we can easily see them. The reason we cannot see them from Earth is because of its obliqueness and what it's made of. However, that adds to the theme. And the theme of the rings is it's meant to be hidden. When you measure the differences between the rings, I get in thousandths 53, 68, and 78. 53 is the product of 15 and 38. 68 is the product of 23 and 45. And 78 is the product of 27 and 51. Now, in those passages in Mark, Luke, and Matthew, there it speaks of a curtain of the temple was torn in two. And for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And at the moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom, the earth shook and the rocks split. So it's opened an access, a new and giving way through the veil. So it's a hidden veil that's keeping something hidden. And when Jesus was crucified, it was split. We also have a comparison with the trembling veil. The corrugations, if you look at Jupiter's rings, they are corrugated like this, and that adds to the theme of a past disturbance tilted a dust sheet. Gravity, Jupiter's gravity's wound, it not spiral. Wavy bands, a curtain that remembers the shock. Jupiter's axial tilt of 3.13 degrees is listed out here, where we spoke about it. We spoke of the axial tilt earlier and how it all brings us to passages of a lawful commission. Now, Jesus being baptized and how he goeth up and how he's ascending and all these sorts of passages. Now, so there are 10 corridors, and they bring us to these passages sharper and dividing asunder without shedding of blood. And what does it mean? Why do we see this? Well, the veil exists, so it's a forward scattering dust. Here you can actually see the rings with an ultraviolet camera. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 20. Why does Jupiter even pull the Sun itself? Jupiter's gravity is so strong it'll pull the Sun 1.068 times its own radius. So Jupiter has a strong pull on the Sun. Why? What does it mean? What does it thematically mean? So when we take some measurements and we bring them to some passages, we learn that it's a choice from his shoulders and up, being upward and higher than other people, a sign upon thine hand and frontlets between thine eyes. We come to passages with one king dies and another takes over. Then there is a reference where there fell some Manasseh to David. So there fell some of Manasseh to David. So ye have dealt long enough in this mount, and knowest thou ordinances in heaven. So what's it about? It's the successor to the king. So we have references to when Bela died, Jacob reigned, Jobab reigned in his stead. So this calculation here of 1074 brings us to this passage here where somebody reigned in his stead. Then we have a reference to where there fell some to David and the great host. We also have references to law and life and pulled but not dethroned. So what is the synthesis? It's law plus life. The 10.68 brings us to law and life. 10 law and 68 life. So Jupiter's pull on the Sun stands as a crucifixion and ascension marker in the sky. The throne moves, the king remains, and all things are drawn to him by decree. Now, finally, now that we've answered our 20 question, there was a reference to juniper, which sounds like Jupiter. So I decided to study this plant, and what I came out with is juniper is this plant, white broom, and it speaks of sharp arrows of the mighty with coals of juniper. So the word of God and how long it takes got something to do with that. But let's study this plant. Now when you study this plant, you'll find that its root actually has a 24-hour burn time. So it can be used as charcoal. We also find that the plant has 48 chromosomes, which matches Jesus as the high king sitting with 24 elders. The plant's DNA plus the burning time, 48 and 24, sums up to 72, which could also be themed as a sent witness around a king. We can also come to the calculation of 66 and the 57 with the plant's height is 5.7 cubits. So just over half portion of the small earth of the store. It's a repeatable design. We have the 40, 480. If you take the 20 meter root depth by 24, you get to 480. High King in the Lord. So God picked a slow burning desert plant to describe his answer to evil. That's what juniper is all about. So I thought I'd just add that in because I answered my own question. I thought I'd just share it with you. So what is Jupiter all about? What is the whole conclusive, final, strongest theme that I'm getting? Well, it's a shepherd standing at the door. The tilt feels like forgiving. The red storm that didn't win It's about a wound yet healing and the order persists. We have lawful stripes, a halo and a voice, the cross of moons, the court and crowd, the weekly crown, the mercy timing, and refuge. We could further break this into servants who keep their eyes on the king, as in the 8 Galilean moons. We have the 2 big lanes cross. This is the cross gathers a scattered family back into order. We have a weekly crown. So weekly crown resting in the right timing. We have the crowd and the court with all the other moons, which the parallel is a small court near the throne. We have 70 times 7 in the rhythm of forgiveness. Why Jupiter matters to us? Well, it's a good shepherd a good shepherd at the door keeps the flock safe. So ultimately we have the big kind shepherd at the door, the tiny tilt that preserves peace, the red storm and the healing order. So I wanted to do a separate Hebrew and Greek analysis to bring this in at the end and try and understand further, because if you take these measurements and numbers of Jupiter's sizes, we get to these core meanings and theme from the translations, which is now 86, the equatorial diameter of 86,000. 86 is Elohim, which is God, Elohim. Then we have the covenant helper, the Moses, the lawgiver, 345. We have the oak of weeping, the charcoal, 439. 68 is life. 182 is Jacob's covenant people, to teach, instruct, to magnify the gift, and beloved, 27. So Christ is the high king, the lawgiver, protector at the outer gate. And that does fit very strongly with what the ancient Greeks described Jupiter to be, being the king of the heaven and the star of Zeus. The speed of sound on Jupiter is in kilometers per hour. It's 1080 kilometers per hour, or 36,000 meters per second, which is derived from a unit conversion from the 300 meters per second. And what's interesting is that 1080 is be born again in Hebrew. Finally, because I have the study now and because we understand what Jupiter's doing, we can understand the weather conditions and the patterns and the things that happen in space are not an accident. Now in 2006, on the 24th of February, all these asteroids crashed into Jupiter. They crashed into Jupiter at exactly a co-latitude angle of 13 degrees. And from the Great Red Spot was 11 degrees. And look at the position, the latitude position is 33 degrees south. Again, very biblical numbers. So what's going on here? Well, what I managed to do was align it exactly to the day that there was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The 24th of February to the 24th of February 2022 is exactly 16 years. 16, the number to harden the hearts of man. So all these other events that Putin did, other than invading Ukraine, but all these other major events, I call them Putin's milestones. Putin's milestones can be linked up with the position and the angles that these asteroids crashed into and the date. Now what's furthermore is you can also line it up with terrorist attack. So this is where we can use a study like this now to understand weather conditions and things like that. Now there is another red spot, a red spot junior. And this red spot junior crashed into the giant red spot and came out the other side. Not something scientists have ever witnessed. And anyway, when you study the measurements, you can line that other red spot up with terrorist attack. So that's quite interesting. Now finally, I wanted to do a stats check with key biblical numbers and where you can find them in Jupiter's numbers. Numbers like 52, which is the distance to Jupiter's orbit, can be found 41 times. 66 can be found 18 times. 72, 12 times. Jesus' number, 106, I found can be found 24 times. And 107 I've found it 20 times, but I've found it a few extra times since I made this list. So this list needs to be updated. But if you look at what a very high number count here of typical biblical numbers. And here is just another update on the 144, just to make sure we understand what that's about. A wall of daily mercy. Now, I have put together a test because, believe it or not, but the world does not have a test process that can test a study like this and tell you how believable it is. So I've created one. And what it does is it first checks your facts, your numbers, your measurement. Then it has numerical lane transparency, reproducibility, multi-comparisons, a theological test, cumulative test, and a cross-domain test. And it gathers all your documents. Now, this is just some of them. That's not all of them that I have to create this study. And there's a few things I've left out of this presentation because this presentation is just an initial startup to understand Jupiter. Basically, it does a test process within each document, and it gives you a score and a result, and it tests the result. It has a weighting process. And I've also gone to a revision 2 because I've calculated the number of the beast and Jesus' number. Calculations like that can be found inside many other places of the world or other studies, that's when you know it has truth and believability because other studies back up and support your other study. So we've gone to a revision 2, making this report even stronger, and this study gets a whopping 87% overall. Now, if you've not seen my other video on the site of Tiwanaku, go away and check that out because there you will see very similar measurements that we found in the Jupiter study, because here in the center, this is the site of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and this holy of holy passages here is 68 by 46 by 63. It has a place for 7 lampstands. And here Jesus is clearly holding a 7-sealed scroll with 2 cherubim sticking out of it, just like the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because it contains the Word of God. So here Jesus is standing with these 22 links around his ankle. So what I'm saying is you can find very similar measurements. And there Mary is standing. And this spot here is the number 25 came up in the study quite a lot. And 55 is also a number that came up in this study of Jupiter, 55, which related to the oil that anointed Jesus before his crucifixion is 55. Now, if you calculate Jupiter's weight in talents, it's 5.5 times 10 to the 25. So there is a clear understanding of that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please share and like it with your friends, and look out for the next one. Goodbye.